Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyun Park from Amalgam Insights here with Charlie Araujo, as always. And thanks for joining us. Please feel free to like, subscribe, and tell us what you think in the comments. But as we get started, how are you doing today, Charlie?
I am doing great. It's been a very busy period, but I'm doing some really exciting stuff, which I'll share with everyone, I guess, in the future. But it's very, very exciting. It's kind of getting me, one of those things that just gets you up every morning. So I'm excited about what we're doing.
Excellent. Personally, I've been really busy working on my upcoming FinOps vendor landscape. The smart list is what we call it over at our neck of the woods. So I've been digging into literally hundreds of different FinOps solutions and trying to narrow it down to the most differentiated ones. So it takes a lot of time because a lot of these, frankly, sound very similar. IT cost is obviously a very big topic right now. Everybody's been coming out with their own perspectives, and I have my own take on how the quality of some of this. But be that as it may, I'll have my own say soon enough. So I can't complain too much about everybody else saying what they're saying. But because of that, IT cost being a big deal, one of the things that I did notice this week is Gartner putting out some IT numbers associated with the IT Expo or symposium that they just had. And, there's some interesting trends within those IT numbers.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Gartner is probably of the major analyst firms, one I probably trust the least when it comes to their numbers. I tend to look at people like IDC better, but it's always another good data point. And I think what is really fascinating about these numbers is the fairly significant growth they're seeing, both in what they're calling the Gen AI tax, which I think is an interesting way of looking at it, but growth in general IT spend, but mostly being passed through is sort of the idea that it's spend that software companies aren't capturing because they're having to spend that money on these Gen AI tools. But probably the big shocking one that you pointed out is the data center spending they're predicting is up 24%. And the hard part, and this is sort of why I don't always like the Gartner data, is that they're not very clear from my perspective on where that is coming from. Because if that's including all the hyperscalers and all the major Gen AI players and OpenAI and all those guys, then it's like, duh, yeah, of course we're seeing massive growth.
Mhm.
If these are traditional enterprises and we're seeing a 24% uptick in data center spending, that's a shocking number, like shocking, shocking. They, of course, are attributing it to increases in AI spend or preparing for AI workloads or Gen AI workloads. And if those numbers are true and are coming from traditional enterprises, it's sort of, well, I don't say it's out of sync. It does kind of signal maybe a shift that's happening because everything we're hearing from CIOs right now is that they're in the very early stages, still experimenting. We've been talking on this show a lot about some of the articles about increasing pressure to show results, but pressure to show results and making those first steps is not the same as spending money. And so if we're seeing an actual increase in spend, or at least an anticipated actual increase in spend of that to that degree, that's pretty notable that this stuff is really starting to come to a head.
Yeah, maybe they're just saying that NVIDIA has been selling a whole heck of a lot over the past year. No, I mean, that's not going to be the entire $100 billion increase, but obviously there's a lot of capex involved with getting AI up and running. And either you have to invest in that or you've got to buy that through the hyperscalers. There's not really any way to get around that conundrum if you really want to invest in AI. And I find that hardware making a comeback being very interesting, but also I thought it was interesting that software spend continues to grow quickly. We are seeing over 10% growth in Gartner's numbers. And I tend to think of Gartner's numbers being accurate on a going backwards basis. I think if you're looking at 2024 and you look at their 2023 spend, I think that'll be pretty accurate. The forecasting, um, I have some issues with. I feel like they tend to look too linearly at trends and not really thinking about drivers quite so much. IDC tends to do a better job, but be that as it may, they are showing some numbers of what is happening right now, which I'm pretty sure are accurate. Gartner has good infrastructure for tracking the current state of spend.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting that, the shocking number from data center notwithstanding of software is, of course, the perennial outperformer. And again, they're showing 12.6% growth for 2024. I think the other thing that's notable is that it's pretty much spending is increasing across the board. And this does sync with what I'm hearing from CIOs that I
Mhm.
talk to, that there is, despite all the downturn and all the ambiguity, and generally in an election year in the US, you see a pullback, you see people kind
Yeah.
of
Mhm.
hunkering down a bit. And I think this is a function of Gen AI. It has created so much momentum that people have to be doing something, that everyone is saying spend, this is a rising tide that floats all boats. Everyone is spending. And so I think on the one hand, that's good. I also think that going all the way back to that other conversation we've had is it does lead back to, hey, you better be prepared to show significant results around all of this. And how is that going to happen? So, yeah, interesting data. How much would I, if I'm a CIO, do I take any of this? Well, my take on it would be, if I'm spending more, that isn't necessarily going to get me competitive advantage. Everyone's spending more right now, and you better be prepared to demonstrate results from it, because that's going to be where this is driving from.
Yeah, and the political election topic is an interesting one. I'm not going to dig too far into that, but I would say that it doesn't seem like either political party is very excited about really adding AI legislation at this point. That doesn't seem to be an enormous risk. So it's not affecting spend the way that politics typically affects the tech world. So yeah, expect, at least on the CIO side, your budgets are either going to stay steady or rise, or you're going to have a special budget point starting to show up for some of this extra spend that your company is going to put into tech.
Maybe we'll have to have a special election show to talk about the non-event, at least from a tech standpoint. But what is interesting is, so there was a Wall Street Journal article that covered some comments from NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang, and what I think is interesting about it, he's basically making the case, talking about all of the spend and whether or not this is traditional enterprise spend.
Mhm.
He's basically making the case that every traditional enterprise now needs to be AI first. And frankly, I hate that terminology. It harkens back to the every company needs to be a software company, which I always thought was BS.
Mhm.
You know, that said, if you read, sort of get past the hype, he basically is making two primary points. The first is that AI is going to be most impactful when it's used for transformational activities, when it's used to sort of re-envision the way you're doing things. Wholeheartedly agree with that. And the second thing is, he's making the case that organizations should be creating what he calls the AI brain. Again, hate the terminology, but this idea of effectively a big giant data repository or a graph database that is AI is mining to understand the context of how your individual enterprise operates, and then uses it as an executional tool. That 100% agree with. And if that's what he means by AI first, I think that is interesting. And I think it is also interesting because it is, to a certain extent, counter to how most organizations, I think, are looking at leveraging AI today. Although I think it's starting to change, and we'll talk about some of that later.
Yeah. So ironically, Jensen Huang is basically talking about the vision of ERP. SAP, Oracle, and others have sold to us for such a long time. Having this brain of information that reflects what happens in our company from a data and process perspective, and perhaps taking it to the next level and providing some idea of the overall logic and strategic execution that is going on. But that is honestly the right idea for AI. We are looking for technology that helps us with our busy work. We're not looking for technology that replaces human insight at this point, because that simply is not the level that any technology we have really is at. Computers are fantastic, hyper computational uh, technologies. They can do math a whole lot faster than we can, and they can come to conclusions a whole lot faster than we can, but they're not necessarily accurate or contextually correct. We still have to do a lot of work to figure out how to turn this into that, and that's okay. But we should be realistic about what AI actually is.
Yeah, I mean, what I appreciate with the AI brain concept, and it's something that I'm working on separately,
Mhm.
conceptually. Again, I don't like the term, but this idea of it really connects with what Gen AI is good at, of synthesizing data that isn't structured, that we can't stick a pin in and say this means that. It's really good at sorting that out with all the caveats that come with it, but it's really good at that. And so I think it's going to ultimately be, as we've talked about in the past on other episodes, this intersection of different forms of technology. But I think this idea of having this brain or whatever you call it as a sort of central repository is a heck of a way of thinking about it, because I think it gets you down that right path.
Yep.
Um, Speaking of NVIDIA, we have a bunch of industry news to talk about, and the first one is, and we'll cover. There's a whole bunch of these that we'll kind of talk about, but one that's connected to NVIDIA is in the grand scheme of things, a much smaller organization compared to NVIDIA. Zoho, who we're both fans of and we've talked about here in the past, has announced a partnership with NVIDIA just a few days ago. And I found it surprising from a Zoho perspective, mostly because their ethos is sort of we march to the beat of our own drum. We tend to not follow the pack, all of that sort of stuff. And NVIDIA is, of course, the 800-pound gorilla. So um, had they done or doing some kind of a deal on chips, I sort of would have expected them to go with one of the more disruptive players that was sort of taking the same disruptive sort of tone that Zoho does. But other than that, I think it's good for Zoho, who has largely sat out a lot of this. I mean, they've been working on their LLMs and smaller language models and what have you, but we don't talk about them a lot with all of our AI stuff because they've been kind of sitting on the sidelines a little bit. And again, as always, marching to the beat of their own drum. But what was your take on this announcement?
Yeah, so a few things happening there. That first, NVIDIA was doing their India event, which is part of what we were referencing in the prior section. So, of course, they wanted to talk about their India-centered partnerships, and Zoho is a natural there as an India-headquartered software company and a relatively large one by those standards. But also, I think it speaks to the fact that NVIDIA is increasing the breadth of its partnerships and not just looking at Amazon or Microsoft or other trillion-dollar companies. It is starting to look at the next level of software companies and saying, we also need to be able to integrate with this as well. And then third point is that Zoho has always been a very practical company. They have decided to partner with whoever their customers are working with, and they really don't have an axe to grind in that regard. They are always happy to make integrations and partnerships at a practical level. So I think this starts to speak to the fact that Zoho, as a more of a mid-market company, is starting to run into customers saying, we are also trying to figure out our NVIDIA strategy, specifically looking at our AI along with the NVIDIA NeMo microservices and the AI training capabilities associated with NVIDIA GPUs. And we need you to be able to help us with that partnership at the end of the day. So Zoho, of course, they have their analytics capabilities that go across BI and predictive analytics and data science. They say this seems to be a natural way for us to partner with the outside world in this circumstance. And also, I think it speaks to the fact that pretty much if you are a data science company at this point, you need to have some sort of integration with these NeMo microservices to continue serving your customers.
Yeah, no, I think it makes a ton of sense for them. I think that they need to have a foot in this game. They need to have a story to tell, and I think they have. Well, I think they've been doing some good things. They were a little bit behind on this, and
Mm-hmm.
so they need to have a better story to their customers. I mean, let's remember they're not a small company, right? They're a billion-dollar company, so they're not small by any stretch. But I think that they play in a unique space, and their customers, I think particularly, Zoho is this interesting organization that has a whole bunch of SMB customers, but also has a very large footprint in what I call the small to medium sized enterprise. And I think these
Hmm.
customers are coming under pressure to say, what is our AI strategy? And if we've partnered with a company like Zoho, then what is their strategy that we're adopting? And they needed a better story to tell. And so, in that way, I think the partnership with NVIDIA makes a lot of sense and helps them tell a better story.
You're right. Hmm.
So speaking of AI and all this, pretty much all of the rest of our industry news, as usual, is going to be about AI. But specifically, it's like the game has changed. We're not just talking about Gen AI anymore. Now it's all about agentic AI. And so there were a total of four, well, I'm sure there are more, but four announcements right now that we're going to kind of talk about, all hitting on various aspects of this. So Asana launches their new tool for creating their AI agents that they call teammates. Microsoft, not surprisingly, I think it was on the eve of Salesforce's Agentforce going live, announced their competing autonomous agent tool. So I think 10
Hmm.
pre-built agents plus a platform to build your own. And then the two that I'm actually more interested in talking about, and we can circle back if you want to cover the first two, but the two that you raised up that I think are really, really interesting from two wildly different perspectives is Celonis introduced their approach that they're calling Agent C. Um, Kind of an
Hmm.
interesting. I haven't seen any of the marketing stuff. I'm envisioning like a 007 character with the hat or something. And UiPath introducing their approach um, to leveraging Gen AI agents as part of their platform, which of course they're a traditional RPA player that has been RPA in general has been very threatened by all of this. And I thought it was very interesting. So those two both have very interesting aspects. But before we dive into those two, just your overall take, or did you want to go talk about the other two?
Yeah, just a couple of quick takes are, Asana taking the teammate approach. This has been a criticized approach already earlier this year. So it's interesting that Asana saw some of uh, some of that media outrage and still decided to go in that direction. Basically saying, "Oh, we are going to frame these Asana agents as teammates." And I'm honestly not sure that's the right approach because I don't think we think of AI as an actual teammate at the enterprise or business level. I think it's still very much at an assistant level. I guess it's a branding decision. But that said,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
in their defense, they're trying to position this as, I think they're trying to make it feel more autonomous, like a teammate I would hand something off to, it does it and hands it back. And I think that, let's not forget, right? Asana is a work management platform.
Hmm.
They are designed to be a tool first and foremost for the individual knowledge worker to sort of deal with their piece of a puzzle, but as part of a larger context. And so it sort of makes sense. I mean, I get what they're trying to get to. I think the hard part is that they're large. I fear they're going to get lost in the shuffle with all of this. There's so much going on that I think that message is going to get lost, at least with anyone outside of their core customer base. So we'll see. And maybe that's all that matters. It's going to be relevant for their customer base. I mean, they're certainly, if I look at these other companies, well, actually, I'm not sure if they're smaller than them or not, but certainly compared to a Salesforce or a Microsoft. So it's going
Right.
to be interesting. But I think what is important is the reason I don't want to talk about it or not that interested in talking about it is it's it's much less interesting than the approaches that both Celonis and UiPath are taking, which I think are creating some very unique anchor points for them.
Yes, I think that so I'll start with Celonis that I think their process intelligence uh, uh, mindset actually was a step ahead of what everybody else was talking about, call it 5 years ago, when we were trying to figure out what is the right rules-based way to automate work and to figure out how to make complex workflows happen. And then we got this generative AI thing that takes this non-deterministic approach, which is more flexible, less accurate, but also very attractive to a bunch of people. And Solona said, well, we've got to figure out how to merge our approach with this approach. And that's an interesting combination because we're talking about a company that now has been thinking about process mining deeply for a very long time. And now adding some of that actual deterministic and rules-based logic to the Gen AI world in this to create these AI assistants. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Well, so we'll see
Mhm.
where that ends up, but I will say this: I think that process mining is something I've been a huge fan of Celonis and process mining as a category for a very long time. I think it is, I'm a process guy at heart, so this has always been sort of, such a critical element that I thought people have not given enough credence to. And I think Celonis was an interesting sort of case study because they're obviously large, they've grown well, they have some very big partnerships with companies like ServiceNow, and yet, for all this upward momentum they seem to be having, I feel like it plateaued. I feel like there are
Mhm.
those companies that sort of got it, drank the Kool-Aid and understood it, but they never quite reached that tipping point where process mining became a de facto way that organizations operated. And I was disappointed by that. And so I think to a certain extent, their approach here is a necessary evolution. They have to figure out how to get to this next point where organizations are saying that this process awareness is central to our ability to execute and function, particularly against our AI strategy. And my hope, my concern for them is they don't overshoot, right? And that's I don't personally see that their primary focus should be to provide a conversational agent themselves. I think that they are correct in that their process graph provides a foundational technology that they should be partnering with other organizations to leverage as the basis, because when we look at where Gen AI succeeds and where it fails, it always succeeds or fails based on the quality of the context that you can give it, right? And they are correct. Celonis is correct in their statement in this. I don't know if it's an article, I guess, or press release, but
Mhm.
where they talk about the fact that every enterprise's context is unique, and it is existing within their process makeup, right? Within that process structure, that their entire business model is based on an exposing, bringing up, and allowing you to see what's actually happening. So I think there's tremendous potential here, as long as they don't get too sucked into the Gen AI thing where they're trying to be the Gen AI co-pilot for everybody or whatever, and then I think they're going to lose it.
Yes, but they definitely could play a very important role as the contextualization cog that
Yep.
translates every LLM into an actual business tool. Because that middle aspect of understanding what is the business jargon that I really need to contextualize and emphasize in my results is definitely what Celonis has in spades.
Unquestionably. And that is what is interesting about that particular statement is it's actually, while 180 degrees on the other end of the spectrum,
Mhm.
is sort of similar to UiPath. So it's interesting. This article by John Reed, who I guess I followed a little bit, but I really appreciated the way he approached this particular article, because he talks about how he's been going on and on about. In fact, I'm just going to read his opening paragraph because I thought, or opening line. He says, "So I wrote an epic missive on the absurdity of AI agent overhype. We both agree with that. Hopped on a plane to Vegas to hear UiPath make splashy new announcements about AI agents." And he basically goes
Mhm.
on to explain that he was pleasantly surprised. And what made him pleasantly surprised was something that I've talked a lot about historically, and that is that UiPath has, in their go-to-market approach, is sort of addressing the reality. They put up I guess, a slide, and one of their lines was agents cannot be trusted, right? It was like they're acknowledging the fact that you
Mhm.
can't do everything just using these Gen AI agents, right? You need to be mixing it together. We've talked a lot about, or I certainly have talked a lot about, the need to mix it with predictive or traditional approaches to AI. And they're making the case you need to also mix it, and not surprising, get they're an RPA player, but mix it with traditional forms of script-based automation, right? That doesn't have AI in it, that you need the sort of whole complement to solve the business problems that you're trying to solve. And so what John, the author, I think appreciated, and what I appreciated through his eyes, was this very pragmatic approach to it, of both accepting and recognizing that agents are going to be a part of this future, but also acknowledging that it's not some magic panacea, and we need to deal with this pragmatically and mix all these different technologies together. So I love that approach.
Yeah, John Reed has definitely been a critic of enterprise AI, and I think in a positive way. Uh, as this AI era has unfolded. But I do think UiPath has a couple of challenges here that their traditional rules-based RPA honestly is starting to fall apart under its own weight. It is starting to become technical debt in organizations that have built out UiPath RPA to a large extent. And that's simply the nature of the technology. It was rules-based, and once you get to thousands of rules or bots within your organization, there's going to be conflict. It's going to be difficult to manage going forward. So you have to have,
And in fairness, not just them, all the RPA players,
yes,
right, that are
this is just
struggling
the
there. Yeah.
nature of the technology
Yep.
approach that we started doing a decade ago. It is not a fault of any individual vendor, but as a result, every single one of these RPA vendors now has to start thinking about how to move forward and include some of this AI-based logic. And I think UiPath, among others, has an advantage here in that the same challenge of managing bots at scale is going to happen with managing agents at scale. So agentic platform orchestration might be a little bit of a mouthful, but I think that agentic platform orchestration is going to be an important next step because it's not going to be one agent. It's not even going to be one platform. It's not going to be one model. We're going to have to deal with the entire panoply of models and agents out there, and that's going to be a potentially important role for the RPA players to play because there aren't many other technology platforms that are able to really handle that kind of that challenge right now.
Yeah, I agree. I think, I've been fairly bearish on the RPA space for a while, and I'm not convinced that this is enough to save them. I think that the challenge is that they were a very unique technology, mostly driven by their unique technical differentiator was the ability to do screen scraping, right? I mean, and so increasingly, the core differentiator is falling away. And so the hard part here is they're competing with everybody because everyone is producing agents that are doing various forms of automation. And so I think the jury is very much still out. But my big take on this was that of the RPA vendors, I think UiPath is doing a pretty good job here of carving out a reasonable future that has that sort of pragmaticness to them. And you remember they went through a whole bunch of turmoil earlier this year. So given that this is what's coming out, I think is a very good sign for them. So, we'll see. We'll see where this
Yeah,
goes.
and frankly, I think it helps them that Daniel Dines is back as CEO. As the founder, he had the vision for the company, and understandably, once the company matured, he kind of stepped back, as often happens because founders love building stuff more than managing large, cumbersome enterprises. But we're at a point where he has to come back and be a visionary again, which is what he loves to do. So hopefully, he can figure out how to put the pieces together one more time.
Yeah, so we will see. Well, speaking of visionaries and speaking of RPA, um, the other big sort of agentic AI announcement came from Anthropic this week, where they introduced their new release of Claude 3.5 Sonnet. But really, the big announcement was that as part of that, they released public beta of what they're calling computer use via the API. And computer use is just what it sounds like. The model now has the ability to effectively take over your computer and read the screen, literally pixel by pixel, and do keystrokes and mouse, scrolls and mouse clicks and what have you, as a way to actually create action, right? To take
Mhm.
personal action on your device. And it's an incredibly early. This is not one of those like fake betas. That's really just a precursor to release. This one has all kinds of issues. They freely admitted, and kudos to them for being visionary and pushing this out there and putting it in the wild and letting people test it with all of its flaws. That said, I went through and I watched some of the demos and I was reading through and I'm just like, I'm scratching my head. I'm like, going back to the whole RPA, it's like this feels like just another version of RPA where we're effectively screen scraping. And it's like in
Mhm.
this age where everything is digitized, is that really our best approach? Is that really the best way to implement an agentic AI solution? And, maybe I'm not smart enough to get why this is necessary, but I struggle with this. I struggle with why I'm not instead looking at ways that I can inject into the data stream and understand what's going on without having to read the flipping screen, and then take action based on that. So I applaud them for their openness. I applaud them for pushing the envelope, and I'm sitting here scratching my head, going, "Why is this the direction we're going in?" I don't know. Did you have a different take on it?
Yeah, at first glance, this reminds me of some of the voice activated computing UIs that have existed for a decade or more. And they're a bit awkward, but you can use some of these voice activated tools to work Microsoft Word or Excel or spreadsheets or slides, call it your app of choice, and it will awkwardly get these things done. You can eventually get it to the cursor to the cell that you're looking for, or to do formatting for your words, but it's not super easy. And honestly, that is where Anthropic's Claude is at this point. The Claude assistant is a little bit more generalized in the tasks that it can do, but honestly, it's not that great at this point. But I do think that there is a potential for this to be more useful as a computing interface. But the challenge is we are facing kind of the same issue that we've seen with Siri, with Alexa, with all of these voice activated or language activated consumer computing UXs. Wow. Thanks, Siri. Yes. Speaking
Yes, we always
of,
have to be careful
thanks, Siri. Wow.
saying the
Yes.
keywords. What I think is what I struggle with here is something that I've talked about a long time, and I don't think I came up with this. So apologies to whoever invented this particular concept, but when we've from the very beginning of technology, we always talked about automation in sort of these two phases or
Mhm.
two waves. And the first wave was simply automating the way things were already being done. Right? If I had a manual process that's 3 steps, I use technology to try to automate those 3 steps.
Mhm.
But the transformative power of technology came when you realized that this technology could be used to completely reinvent that process, to re-envision it, and to therefore make it much more effective, efficient, productive, whatever, because you were no longer bound by those steps. And what I feel like this is like in that first category, where it's trying to simply use this technology to replicate how we interact with the computing interface, but in the end, that isn't really what I want. I want to tell it what I want to do and go figure out how to do it. I don't care how you do it. Just go get it done. You don't need to go and do it the way I would have to do it. In fact, doing it the way I would have to do it is probably a pretty inefficient way. So I wanted to really be excited about this, and maybe when I see it in the wild, I will have a different opinion. But as of right now, I was kind of like a big shrug.
Yeah, the irony to me is that because of the nature of generative AI, this might have unintended effects. For instance, I am betting that it's going to be difficult for computer use to figure out something like, in cell C23, give me the accurate summation for the revenue of my company in 2024. Something I might ask for from a job perspective. However, it might find it very easy to do something like, hey, sign me up for a social security number. Never mind that I already have one or whatever. Like, it might be able to figure out how to navigate that social security website extremely easily based on the language that it looks at, and by clicking in the right places and entering the right information by assumptions. And it makes it easier to do computer-based or web-based fraud while not making it easier to do the work that we are trying to do from a practical perspective. We'll see. Obviously, this is Anthropic's problem, but I've also seen that the likes of Google and Microsoft are also trying to get on the bandwagon quickly and talk about their plans to also support desktop-based work on agents. So this is going to be something that we see from other companies as well. It's just Anthropic was the first to really put something out there.
Yeah, and to that point, it didn't even make it into our list because it happened so late breaking. But just today, Google announced Jarvis, which is their version of this, and we have very little information on exactly what that's going to look like. But
We'll probably chat more about
yeah,
it next week. Yep.
exactly. I'm sure we will. So just it's really an interesting development, and we'll see. And if nothing else, though, trying to always get the CIO lens on this. What is the takeaway? The takeaway is let's not forget, for all of our talk about finding value and driving revenue and all of those things from AI, we are very much in experimentation stage where these technologies are coming and going at light speed because we're trying to figure out what works and what makes sense. And so you need to just take everything with a very big grain of salt.
Yeah, but that's part of the exciting part about this, though, that we have all this primary research that is being turned into products in weeks. And normally this stuff sits in somebody's lab for 5 years and never gets turned into anything, just like Xerox PARC did with the basically the Windows UI or the Mac UI, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, and it makes it difficult if you're in that CIO seat or any enterprise IT leadership suite of figuring out where to place those bets and try to maneuver through that. And especially because you need to assess it both at a micro level, specifically to your organization and your go-to-market and your business strategies, but also at the macro level. And speaking of that macro level, OpenAI made a fairly big hire. I mean, I think Hyoun, you and I probably have slightly different opinions on this one, but they hired their first chief economist, and his name is Aaron Chatterjee. I think that's how
Chatterjee,
you're saying it.
yes.
And his mandate is basically to really help OpenAI figure out what the economic impacts of AI are going to be, and ostensibly, therefore, to use that to guide their efforts.
Mhm.
Super, super macro. But I think an important part of this, because this is going to have big ramifications in understanding how it all fits together.
Yeah, and one of the so we've seen a bunch of estimates around the potential value of AI, just like mind blowing, 1 trillion, 2 trillion, $4 trillion estimates from the likes of Accenture and Morgan Stanley. And those are nice, but I don't know how much I trust them. And frankly, I think OpenAI is saying the same thing. We're not sure how much we trust that number either. We want somebody with actual skills to figure out what that number could actually be, because from a software perspective, we tend to look for a few 100% ROI from our investment. So if we think there's, call it $1 trillion of value, that might mean there's a $200 billion to be made in over that lifespan in the actual services themselves. That might be, say, 20 billion a year. And OpenAI wants to know, how are we going to make 20 billion a year going forward based on the use cases that actually might exist. So that part is smart. My doubt about this is whether Chatterjee will be able to make real progress in this role. I'm always suspicious of people who take a job and may not be doing it full time, or may not have a team of people to be able to follow up on the work that they're doing. And until I see the team around Chatterjee specifically at OpenAI, to look at the economics of AI, I'm going to be a little doubtful as to whether they're able to really make significant progress on this challenge that is a legitimate challenge. I think that there are probably hundreds of economists at this in the world who would be chomping at the bit to study the global impact of AI on the global GDP. It's a super hot topic. That's not the issue. The issue is all about operationalization and execution here.
Yeah, I mean the big risk here is that it's window dressing and that it's
Mm-hmm.
not actually, because OpenAI has an outsized role in sort of setting the tone and guiding the conversation. And that'll be the big question mark. So we'll have to see how that plays out. We'll have to keep an eye, see what kind of noise he makes. Um, but speaking of that, I think we can wrap up on this sort of concept of this idea of risk, because we tend to be very bullish on the show and talk a lot about all the positive things, and I think we have our good healthy dose of skepticism, but it can be easy to forget that there's a whole lot of risk associated with all of this. And so maybe we'll make this as a new section of the show, our nepotism section. We're going to talk about two articles, only partially nepotism. For the first one is an article written by Jason Bloomberg of Intellex, and I used to work for Intellex. I used to work for Jason, and so that's my nepotism. But he had an article about uh, basically the inevitable Gen AI crash that we can chat about, and then the other one is your brother wrote an article or a post, I guess, but a super long post, basically an article on LinkedIn about Perplexity's recent spate of lawsuits against them. And
Mm-hmm.
so we can chat about both these, but both risks that I think if you're a CIO, you need to be thinking about. So I'll kick off on the Intellix one. Jason has always been a bit of a skeptic, and basically what he's saying is, hey, been here, done that. We've seen these sort of bubbles before, and that there's going to be a crash. I'm not sure I completely agree that there's going to be a crash, but I think it's unquestionable that we're in a hype cycle and that there's just all kinds of craziness to be had. The biggest thing that I think that I took from it was that he identifies a handful of things that, as he said, smart moves to protect yourself is what he calls it. And the first is follow the business value. Could not agree with it more. This idea that it's always needs to be focused on the business problem that you're solving, and if that is your guide, then you're going to be um, in a good place. And then to kind of spread your risk, right? That it's not about just AI. This is what we are just talking about. It's not about just Gen AI. It's not even just about AI. That there's all these other forms of ways that you can create value, and you need to be mixing all of it together. So there's a whole lot of it in here, but I thought it was a good reminder of we need to be looking at both sides of this.
Yes, but I think the skepticism needs to be balanced. So if you look at the companies that are billion-dollar startups right now in the AI space, yes, a bunch of them will crash and burn. No doubt about it. And if you are investing your resources in any of these billion-dollar AI startups, call it OpenAI or Anthropic or Cohere, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you need to have a backup in place for any of them. I don't care which one you're using, because I think it's very likely that a market leader will fall apart. If you look at the .com era, we were talking about companies like Yahoo being the internet. And obviously, that's not what came to pass. Yahoo and AOL are no longer the dominant internet forces that exist now. Flip side is, if you worked at Yahoo or if you worked at AOL, you were dealing with internet scale problems that ended up being extremely useful in your career. We laugh at, and Jason even brings up, pets.com. We all bring this up as a joke. But today, the idea of selling pet food on the internet is a gigantic billion-dollar business. The problem was not that pets.com was a bad idea. It was just early, and we lacked some of the technical capabilities to make it happen. But if you worked at pets.com, you probably were able to use that knowledge for the next 20 years to figure out all of the things that could go wrong with scale out internet services, and then how to solve them and how to use that going forward as new technologies came into place. So there's a lot of useful skills that will come into play by looking at AI now, but some of the individual tools and companies that exist today, yes, probably won't be around in 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I think that was at the end of the day his big message, right? You got to hedge your bets. You need to be looking at this pragmatically, and I think we've been hitting that tone a lot. But it was good to see it sort of all brought together in one place with this nice skeptical clickbaity title.
Mhm.
All right. The other big risk that we want to talk about is the question of indemnity, and your brother wrote this article on LinkedIn, and so why don't you set it up, and we'll wrap up on your brother's article.
Yes. So, just for some context, my brother Leonard Park, he is both a lawyer, went to Santa Clara University, as well as he is a product manager. He has worked for a number of legal tech companies, including LexisNexis. And this is his thing. He uses AI to build legal tech products. And so he has been testing out every AI service that comes in, looks at their APIs, looks at their pricing, looks at the rate, the window sizes, the rates, all of these things to try to figure out, frankly, how to build better products for himself. And he's been looking at Perplexity because it is a fantastic consumer level product. It's been very useful from a search engine perspective. Google has openly talked about how worried they are about Perplexity. And this is part of why you see these crappy AI summaries on Google right now, because they are scared of what Perplexity is doing, quite frankly. But since my brother Leo is also a lawyer, he digs into things like terms and conditions, IP treatment, and he noticed that when Perplexity is providing these terms for users, both on a consumer and on an enterprise perspective. It is hard to actually either, you're giving up a lot of your rights to your own data every time you use Perplexity, which seems to be kind of a problem if you care about running a governed enterprise or if you consider your organization to have intellectual property. So this is something to really be looking out for, because every company is going to do this a little bit differently. And frankly, I feel like a lot of the AI companies are still making up the rules as they go along. They might be covering their own butts a little bit too carefully, or they might not have a lot of experience building enterprise products. And so they are using poor language in their own terms and conditions, or just copying and pasting from bad places.
What I find so interesting about this article and really the entire angle that he sort of took with it is that despite us spending all this time talking about OpenAI and Anthropic going after the enterprise, I hadn't really considered this angle, meaning that every time we talk about that, it's mostly about how do you leverage these LLMs with your own data to provide information that's right. It's all data you own.
Mhm.
Perplexity's model obviously is to disrupt the search engines, and you can use. I mean, you can use OpenAI and you can use Claude to search the internet and do similar kind of things. But Perplexity, unique sort of amongst these, especially because they don't really have their own models; they use other models. Um, is specifically trying to disrupt the search space. And
Mhm.
so, like, I didn't even know they had an enterprise offering. I'm still not entirely sure what you would do with this, but it was just the sort of really interesting examination. And I always appreciate when someone exposes something that I didn't think about, right? But if I'm a CIO and I have my employees using Perplexity, potentially, even if I don't have an enterprise fund, if they're just doing it on their own, right? I use Perplexity all the time, and I don't have an account. Like, I don't pay them any money. um, does that create risk for you? Does that put you as a CIO, your organization, in some form of risk? My gut says it doesn't, indemnity or indemnification or not, just because I don't see the New York Times deciding to go after Boeing because they have some users using Perplexity. But I could be wrong on that. I don't know. It was really interesting to, and what I think more than anything, the article that your brother wrote exposed for me was it's like all the rules are changing. Everything here, when you stick AI in the middle of it, and AI is consuming, sucking up all this data and spitting stuff out in whatever context, it's like everything changes. And so where my mind went is, well, wait a minute. So I'm going back to the legal context. If I happen to have access to LexisNexis in my environment for legal research, and I now bring in a tool and it gets access to that because I need it for some specific use case, am I violating a copyright there? Am I breaking a terms of and condition of that provider? And for that matter, does that hold true with any system of record or any kind of data source provider? It's like these are questions I hadn't really even considered. And so I think, for me, the big takeaway from your brother's article was like, because I have all this more work that, if I'm a CIO, I've got all this more work I better get to doing because I need to really start getting under the covers and figuring out where are my risks. And I think it's going to completely change the game around compliance and governance. It's a whole nother layer.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that the rules have changed as much as that generative AI and search companies have been used to getting away by playing by their own rules. So for the Google search engine being the biggest example, they're used to being able to index the entire web without any consequences, basically, because we made some rules that said that they're allowed to break copyright, basically, for the good of search.
Yeah, well, it was hard, right? It was always based on this. The defense was fair use, and
Mhm.
I feel like it was a fair argument. I mean, we talked about, like I said, I use Perplexity every day.
Mhm.
Now, ironically enough, I use it through another interface, so I'm not even on the Perplexity site most of the time.
Mhm.
But I use it to synthesize data, summarize, and give me a directional idea, and then I click through the links. I'm clicking through anyway, right? And so it is not subverting for me in my use model anyway. The ultimate sort of the same kind of process that traditional search engines would use, or in my opinion, the fair use approach of it. But it just like I said, it just what it really spoke to me is like what we have is more unknowns than knowns here, and
Right.
it's one more thing to figure out.
And I think it's not just the indemnity issue, but you mentioned that you use Perplexity through another service, and Perplexity is claiming to some extent that they could also be owners of that service as part of the flow through. And that is extremely uh, uh, that's difficult to work with, because obviously if you're using an API for your own application, you're not giving that API ownership of your application in any way, shape, or form. So obviously there needs to be a little bit of balance put here as well. That AI companies want as much data as they can get, but does this mean they can have a license to every single bit of data and associated workflow that goes through any aspect of any API in any way, shape, or form? It's probably overreaching just a bit. So uh, something to look out for.
Well, it looks like you and your brother will have something to discuss over Thanksgiving.
Yeah, this is how our Thanksgiving dinners work, and then the rest of our family is bored to tears.
Very nice.
But on that note, I think that's another week here at This Week in Enterprise Tech. Please feel free to like, subscribe, share, and comment on what we've shared with you. And we're looking forward to talking to you next week. Thanks a lot.